All right, well, good afternoon. This is a session on the market revolution. This is part of a larger examination of the antebellum period in American history, the years 1820 to 1860, the years leading up to the Civil War. Remember, big picture goals we want to understand. We want to come to some level of understanding as to the nature and causes of the Civil War, and we want to understand the climate, the political, economic, and social climate in the country prior to the outbreak of the war. What we also want to understand if the Civil War was caused by two societies, a North and a South, that were no longer compatible. We want to understand in what ways were the two sections of the country incompatible. And so this is part of our examination of this. Obviously, it's always encouraged. We want to do our textbook reading out of chapter 9 in the Foner book. So the first half of the chapter deals squarely with what we call the market revolution. Also want to remind you that on the Gutenberg, there are two outside readings that pertain to this chapter, that pertain to this antebellum unit, which is the Irish in America / letters from German immigrants, and a separate article on the Lowell Mill girls. So make sure that you include those two outside readings along with your textbook reading for the market revolution. So the way we get started today, John C. Calhoun, the Southern statesman from South Carolina, said in 1816, quote, "We are greatly, I was almost to say fearfully, growing." And his prophetic sentence expressed both the promise of national greatness and the threat of divisions that would blight Calhoun's own ambition. So Calhoun was a bit of a soothsayer here, a bit of a fortune teller, where he felt like, that the economic expansion after the era of good feelings, the economic expansion that the United States is experiencing, he believed would be of a great benefit to the nation, but feared that as the U.S. economy grew and evolved, that sectionalism would come right along with it. So in the years between 1820, 1860, the United States will experience tremendous growth and expansion in many areas. In agriculture, we have a transportation revolution. The government is going to become more involved in the economy. We're going to see the first industrial revolution. And of course, what drives economic expansion really in all three regions of the United States, the West, the North, and the South, would be a technology, just an immense integration of new technologies into the U.S. economy. The formation of corporations, which coincide with the industrial growth. And as we become more of an industrial nation, we also then become urban. And what allowed the industrialization to thrive is the immigration. So this is an examination. This unit will examine each of these 8 areas. But ultimately, it's a story about change and growth. It's and how, as Calhoun said, it is something that we celebrate, but at the same time, it's something that we fear, because with this change comes sectionalism. So the market revolution, what is it? Quite frankly, it is the integration of the 3 regional economies into one national economy. Okay, so if you've got the North, you got the North, the South, and the West. Prior to the market revolution, each region is operating separate. kind of independently of each other. But America's economic transformation story really gets kick-started when you see the three regional economies become integrated into one, where, for example, the South will send to the North cotton for the northern textile mills. The North will send to the South manufactured products. Proceeds of cotton sales, the South will send the proceeds of the cotton sales to the West, which served as a breadbasket because the Southern economy was not producing foodstuffs, as they were only producing cash crops. And of course, the West provided the growing population in the Northeast with food in exchange for manufactured products. So the market revolution and understanding what it is, it's very complex. It's more than one thing. And so we want to really come to grips as to what all the different definitions of the term. Until the early 19th century, most Americans participated in markets that were local and familiar. They did business with people they knew, and every exchange was embedded within a larger web of relationships. So prior to the market revolution, let's just say that I own a honey farm, and I'm a beekeeper, and I have a honey farm, and I produce honey. Well, prior to the market revolution, I will essentially sell my honey to people within my local community, the people I go to church with. And so my market is very small. And because my market is very small, then the amount of honey that I produce and the number of people that I employ is also small as well. And so the change is when the market expands, in which I'm no longer selling honey to people within my community and to people within, the people I go to church with and the people I work with, but now I sell my honey in a larger market. And so the market revolution is the expansion of the marketplace. Historians call this era as a period in which Americans are better connected to the market. And ultimately, what causes the marketplace to expand and grow will be the construction of new roads and canals. And so as new roads and canals are linking distant communities together, the market for our products, for my honey, for example, my market will expand. Market revolution refers to a new approach adopted by farmers and manufacturers to their work. With distant but lucrative markets now accessible because of the roads and bridges and canals, they now produce for the market rather than for personal consumption. They engage in elaborate calculations designed to do what? Maximize profits in these markets. And this is what we call working the market. Working the market is basically a way to figure out a way to maximize profits. How to secure capital, okay? How to arrange transportation, advertise, and to distribute goods. Okay, so, wow, what did that happen? Let's see, let's try this again. I'm sorry about that. A little bit of a change there. Let's see. Okay, so ultimately, by working the market, as my market expands and as I'm selling my honey, not only to people in my local community and the outlying communities, as my market expands, my profits increase. And what I do with my profits, my capital, is I reinvest it in my honey farm. So instead of owning, for example, one honey farm, I may own 3 or 4 now. And as my business expands, now I hire more people. And ultimately, I'm going to push for new technologies that will help me produce the most amount of honey at the smallest amount of costs in order to maximize my profits. And if I could figure out a technology that can actually do the work of people, then that is one of the most effective ways to work the market in order to maximize my profits as well. And now that my market has expanded, advertising. Now I'm no longer competing with honey farms in my area, in my region. I'm now competing in a very large and vast market. So my honey farm in Bernie, Texas, may now be in direct competition with a honey farm in New Mexico or Louisiana. And so now through advertising, this is the way I attract businesses, or excuse me, this way I attract consumers to buy my honey and not the honey of my competitors. And so one of the byproducts of this market revolution is that small craftsmen were driven out of business by merchant capitalists, skilled workers, and small shop operators. I got to figure out a way to get rid of this bar right here. There we go. Okay. Really, there we go. Sorry, just trying to figure this out. How do I get rid of that right there? Very, very interesting. So anyway, so one of the byproducts is that as my honey farm thrives, there we go. As my honey farm thrives, I put my competitors out of business. And so people, small craftsmen who maybe one time owned their own shops, will be driven out of business by merchant capitalists, people who were able to do what? Maximize their profits. They were able to effectively work the market to where they can sell their products cheap and by at the same time drive their competitors out of business. And so even among those who succeeded under the new conditions, the rapid and sweeping changes that occurred in American labor. Here we go. The rapid and sweeping changes that occurred in American labor relations in general caused a great deal of anxiety. This anxiety inspired a wave of experimentation in areas as diverse as labor organization, health, and religion. So as the market expanded and as the economy grew and as the economy is being shaped and driven by technological advance and this transportation revolution, you found the development of unions, labor unions, temperance reform movements are going to be formed to deal with the adverse effects of all this change. Many religious groups began to beat back against a lot of the changes in progress that came with the market revolution. But while many embraced the new opportunities provided by the new market conditions, others sought refuge from the chaos in new religions, while others abandoned their old markets and old ways, began to think like businessmen. Others tried to slow the forces of change. And so we learned about this in the American Romanticism and Reform and Renaissance unit in the promotion of the reform movements of the antebellum period. American economy wasn't transformed by an industrial revolution during these years, and the most dramatic changes in the American industrial growth were still a half century in the future. So this is the first industrial revolution, but it's really not where the U.S. economy, we use the term take off. It doesn't really take off. It'll obviously, after the Civil War, it will take off at a greater clip. But at the end of the day, what we have to understand is that this new term, the market revolution, refers to the dramatic expansion of the market through the construction of roads and canals. And thousands of miles of roads, canals, mostly funded by private developers, is going to integrate each of these three regional economies into one national economy. Okay? So at the end of the day, Market revolution refers to a dramatic expansion of the market through the construction of roads and canals. Thousands of miles of roads, canals enabled manufacturers, craftsmen, and farmers to affordably transport goods to distant, often more lucrative markets. The expanded arena exchange, a market of increased number of people. Okay, so what is the market revolution? It's a market in which an increased number of people are exchanging goods and products and services among each other. The revolution is one in which people are no longer producing for personal consumption, but rather for the marketplace. It's a transition from a local, regional, pre-capitalist economy to an integrated national economy. And it's a transition away from the old traditional patterns of exchange in which businessmen will enter into a new set of market calculations. So remember, market calculations is a way to try to minimize the costs of production as a way to expand one's profits, expand profits. And that became more central to the calculations of producers, and that became the purpose, as you see down here. It became the purpose of economic behavior. So in a nutshell, the market revolution provided new opportunities and increased freedom. It also generated a great deal of concern. Traditional markets had been limiting, but it helped anchor communities and contributed to social stability. Okay, so as we go through the market revolution, there are some key questions we need to ask ourselves. One, could this new extended market serve a similar role than what we've had before the revolution? Or would it only undermine the social order? Who would oversee this new marketplace? What rules would govern it? And more broadly, what would hold American society together if the nation was transformed into a collection of profit-seeking individuals? Right? So the various components of the market revolution, obviously, we'll address each of these individually. But we're looking at the Industrial Revolution, the Transportation Revolution, a shift from subsistence to large cash crop farming, the creation of a national economy, Western movement, the growth of cities as industrial centers and centers of commerce. But during the antebellum period, during all this remarkable economic change in the country, the United States is going through tremendous demographic changes as well. By 1860, 33 states were in the United States. So in less than a century, the number of states will expand from its original 13 to the addition of 20 new states within the first 100 years. The population was still doubling every 25 years, mostly due to natural increase. But at the same time, the United States was becoming an increasingly a melting pot country. Great diversity. Immigration will add hundreds of thousands of people per year, normally entering through northern ports. And as these immigrants, as we will talk about later on, as these immigrants stepped off the boat, they step off the boat and they walk right into a factory. And so because of the lack of economic opportunity in the South, because of the fact that slaves were the major labor force in the South, immigrants will not enter through southern ports. Immigrants during the antebellum period will enter through northern ports. In 1820, less than 1% of the U.S. population was foreign-born. And by the Civil War, 13% of the U.S. population was foreign-born. And by 1860, the United States, who's not even a century old, is the fourth largest country in the world. And a lot of it is due to the expansion of the economy and the availability of free and cheap land, and just the availability of labor, the availability of jobs. So by 1860, there were 43 cities in the United States that had above 20,000 people. In 1790, in the days of George Washington, there were only 2. And as America became less rural and more urban, cities became areas of slum, crime, and filthy living conditions. So the first industrial revolution, we use the acronym TRIC to learn the various components of the first industrial revolution. The textiles, of course, textile industry, the making of cloth, will be the first industry in the industrial revolution. What will drive economic growth and expansion during the antebellum period will be the construction of railroads. And of course, what really drove economic production, industrial production in the North, would be iron, and of course, what provided the power and the energy to drive the machines of the antebellum period would be coal. And of course, coal would drive the steam engines that enabled there to be so many technological changes, so many advances, so many improvements in transportation. Coal was really the life and blood of the U.S. economy, and definitely the life and blood of the first industrial revolution. Innovations including textile machinery, steam engines, interchangeable parts, the telegraph, and agricultural inventions increased efficiency of production methods. The father of the factory system, Samuel Slater, was among the first to move production out of the home and into the factory. So this industrial revolution, part of the industrial revolution is the idea that we no longer have cottage industries. You can see in the picture above where much of the labor, much of the manufacturing of cloth was done within the home. But because of technological advances, we're going to see production move out of the home and into confines of a factory. Okay, a factory, and Samuel Slater is the father of this factory system, especially in textiles. He built the spinning jenny in 1791. You see the spinning jenny in the picture at the top, which helped take cotton or thread fibers and weave them into thread. The first textile mill was located in Rhode Island. The Pawtucket Mill was the first to be built in the United States. It was in the New England region. Okay, so another innovation, obviously, and we're going to talk about it more in this PowerPoint, is going to be the Eli Whitney's cotton gin in 1793, which will allow really the expansion of cotton plantations in the South, transition the Southern economy away from tobacco, which tobacco was very, very hard on the soil, and really helped transition the Southern economy away from tobacco and towards cotton. The problem with cotton production is that it was not very profitable. It was very difficult to produce. It took a slave 1 day's labor just to pick and produce 1 pound of cotton. And so Eli Whitney's cotton gin will actually speed up the production of cotton by 10 times the previous production rates. So, and of course, the cotton in the South will provide to the New England textile mills, not to just England. It will supply cotton to those mills. Because of cotton, now with the cotton gin, growing cotton is profitable. Now we can make money, and now these Southern planters could increase their acreages, and by increasing their acreages, they could plant more and more cotton, and by planting more and more cotton, it really helped drive the need for more slaves to work the land in these cotton fields. And so the cotton gin, which ultimately was an attempt to do the work of slaves, actually reinvigorate the slave, the institution of slavery in the South. Eli Whitney also introduced the concept of interchangeable parts, which really leads to this modern day assembly line production and mass production, kind of what you'd normally see, the processes within a factory. The sewing machine, invented by Elias Howe and eventually improved by Isaac Singer, helped the textile industry in the North increase production to allow the machines to do the work of people. And not only is this antebellum period a market revolution, industrial revolution, a technological revolution, a transportation revolution, that it's also a revolution in communications. 1844, Samuel Morse invents the telegraph, which provided instant communication over large distances. Now, businessmen were in contact with their suppliers, with their customers, with distant markets, and so the improvements in communication also aided in the success of this industrial revolution. And there were other innovations, Goodyear's vulcanization of rubber, and I included it. In fact, in 1814, an American by the name of Dr. Jacob Bigelow, you'll see his picture there to the right, he is the man who actually coined the term technology. Needed to invent a word to capture the essence of a lot of the change that was going on at the time, a lot of the change that was being fueled by technology, by these improvements and inventions and innovations. So this really tells a story. Really, to study the health of the American economy, all one needs to do is just look at the number of patents that are issued by decade. And you can see that from 1790 to the 1850s, that the number of patents being issued by the United States government had increased dramatically from 77 per year to over 2,500 per year. That tells you a story of what's going on. One of the first factory systems related to the textile industry would be the Lowell system. Other factories will copy and model their system after Francis Cabot Lowell's system that he built in Waltham, Massachusetts. Textile mills, of course, and factories are going to spring up all throughout New England during the 1830s and 1840s. But it was Lowell's system, which was part of the Boston Manufacturing Company. It was a company that had been heavily invested by the Boston Associates, a group of very wealthy businessmen in Boston, are going to invest in this Lowell system. And ultimately, eventually, this small collective of very wealthy men are going to dominate not only the textile industry, but the railroad, insurance, and banking businesses throughout Massachusetts. And so, but the Lowell system kind of gets it started in 1814. 1822, he builds a named Lowell companies organized on the Waltham Plan, that organized based on his system. By 1850, had 1/5 of the total output of cotton cloth. The features of the Waltham Plan included large capital investment, concentration of all processes in one plant under the management, under the managers, specialization in making cloth requiring minimal skill by workers. Water power and steam power eventually will replace the workers, in addition to the infusion of immigrants. So that really gets to the Lowell girls. The Lowell girls would be the first labor source for the Lowell system. Many young girls, of course, left the farm in order to work in these textile mills, these textile factories, thinking that it provided for them better opportunities. They saw this as a way to escape farm life and to earn extra money for the family in these farms. They often worked 12-hour days, 72 hours per week, subjected to discipline, physical abuse, were subjected to curfews. They lived in dormitories. Church attendance was compulsory. And ultimately, these young girls who often the average age was in the neighborhood of 12 to 14 years old, they often ended up leaving the factory, in large part because to get married. That was the #1 cause. Many of them would leave to get married, but ultimately, many of them leave because of just the level of abuse that they endured. 1836, the Lowell girls will organize one of the first labor strikes in U.S. history. Ultimately, the Lowell girls will be replaced by machinery and eventually by European immigrants. Okay. So the Lowell girls. There's an outside reading about the Lowell girls, so make sure you don't neglect your reading. New England was suitable. So we asked, why New England? Why don't we just build the textile mills right there next to where they're growing the cotton? You know, that would really reduce the transportation costs. But ultimately, the reason why New England is going to be the hub of the Industrial Revolution in America is because they couldn't grow cash crops because of because of the weather, because of the climate, because of the rocky soil. Manufacturing was more attractive to farming and to agriculture, just simply because of the geography and the climate. Also, New England had a large amount of cheap and abundant labor. Oftentimes, that labor was the immigrants. We talked about the Lowell girls, but of course, you know, the immigrants coming in from Europe worked for very, very cheap wages. Shipping brought in capital, while seaports made it easy for imports and exports. Because most of the major ports and outlets to the Atlantic were in the north, that made the Industrial Revolution in the New England suitable in that area. The New England area also had rapid rivers that provided water power for the machinery in the factories. And ultimately, the reason why the South has very few factories, because their capital, their wealth was invested in land and slaves. And the local consumers were too poor to afford the finished products that were made. So there wasn't much of a market for the products had they been made in the South. But the number one reason would be the fact that the South invested all their wealth into land and slaves. By 1850, industrial output will exceed agricultural output for the first time in American history. And even though we can trace the industrial growth of the United States back to the Embargo Act of 1807, the Non-Intercourse Act of 1810, and the War of 1812, it really wasn't until after the War of 1812 that the industrial revolution will thrive. In large part because of the tariffs, the tariff of 1816, 1828, 1832, all provided Northern manufacturers relief from foreign competition. So the Transportation Revolution. Transportation Revolution led to the westward flow of planters and their slave gangs to Alabama and Mississippi, just as it facilitated migration of Americans into the Ohio River Valley and the Great Lakes region, where the Indians had been pushed westward during the whole Indian removal period. You know, as an English traveler in 1817 said that old America seems to be breaking up and moving westward. And so there we definitely see it, that from 1810 to 1850, you can see the expansion of the West. In the cotton states in the South, like Alabama and Louisiana, to the western farms in the Northwest, in Indiana and Illinois. Here's a map showing the areas that were settled, 1800, 1810, 1820. This map gives you a great image as to the settlement patterns west of the Appalachians. And ultimately, you can see that a lot of the settlement is around rivers, okay? See the rivers. The population west of the Appalachians, 1800, 387,000 Americans lived west of the Appalachians. By the Civil War, more than half of the nation's population now live west of the Appalachians. And we can attribute this to improvements in transportation, the availability of cheap land, and the availability of credit. The improvement in transportation began to spur the development of a national market. What fueled improvements to transportation? Well, one, as settlers moved west, the demand for better roads increased. Okay, so What fueled the transportation revolution was demand. The American people demanded that roads be built. They demanded a desire, there was a desire of the East to tap the resources of the West. And of course, immigration. Guys, without the canals and the railroads and the roads, without the introduction of the steamboat and other important innovations, we would not have been able to allow the immigrants into the United States during the antebellum period. So here you get a good visual. Yeah, you get a great visual here of what the nation looked like by 1850. You can see the web of roads and canals. You can see canals are largely a northern phenomena, where most of them are concentrated in the Great Lakes region. You also see that, for the most part, a lot of the rail and railroad and roads are connecting the various regions of the country, east, west, and north, south. The first road, the first really significant road is going to be this one here. It's called the National Road. It will connect Baltimore to St. Louis. And that's called the National Road. That's one of your note card terms. And of course, up here, you've got the Erie Canal. Got your Erie Canal, right, where you're connecting Buffalo, New York to the Hudson River. Hudson River takes you all the way to New York City and ultimately the Atlantic Ocean. So the Erie Canal leads to the rapid development of the Great Lakes area. Okay, it connected the northwestern economy to the northeastern economy, and so these two are joined together now, just simply because of the building of these projects. Okay, that's the same map. Okay, so also the rivers were among the first, what we call interstate highways. They were the first interstate highways that are going to facilitate the movement of products and goods and people from the east to the west. What really facilitated increased river travel were the introduction, if you look down here under the third bullet, the steamboats. Robert Fulton's Clermont. The Clermont's the first prototype of a steamboat. And by 1836, there's 361 operating steamboats in the United States. And these steamboats, what it allowed for, the steamboats allowed for the rivers. You know, it's easy going downstream. It's much more difficult going upstream. But the steamboats allowed for two-way travel of the nation's rivers. It led to the growth of an agricultural empire, which became the new breadbasket for America. And so all those farms out west, the wheat farms and corn and the fruits and vegetable farms out west, the steamboats enable those farmers to get their products to market. It led to the expansion of that agricultural empire. Villages along the rivers became strategic trading points and centers of commerce and urban life. So, you know, places like Cincinnati, Ohio, Louisville, Kentucky, St. Louis, Missouri. In fact, St. Louis, by 1860, St. Louis is one of the 5 largest cities in the United States because of the steamboat. Canals, the big one, really the one you need to know. It was built by the New York government. In fact, most canals were not built by private companies. They were built with taxpayer dollars, with state funds. The Erie Canal, which was called Clinton's Ditch, the name of the governor of New York, his name was DeWitt Clinton, and so they nicknamed Erie Canal Clinton's Ditch after the governor. Like I said before, connected Buffalo to the Hudson River, led to extensive economic development of the Great Lakes region, and really the New York system of canals will create nearly 3,000 miles of canals in the whole canal system. And that's a good image as to what it looked like. You know, and you can see along the canals, you've got the farms, you've got the towns, And so the towns serve as the trade posts. It's a place where you load your crops and your hogs and your wheat, and you send it to the east, to the marketplace. So you're growing wheat in Illinois, but your customers, the customers of that wheat, are New York City and Baltimore and Pittsburgh and Boston. What made that possible? Infrastructure projects. There's the flatboats. You know, and that's what the steamboats replace. Again, it's going down rivers one thing, but going upriver is much more difficult. Railroads. Now, obviously, the big game changer in America, and really in arguably one of the most important innovations in American history, is the railroad. The railroads were first built by the English, but by the late 1820s, the United States is engaged in railroad construction. Port cities of Baltimore, Charleston, and Boston were developing plans to build railroads. The first major railroad, 1828, would be the B&O Railroad, which originally connected Baltimore to Washington, D.C. But eventually, the B&O Railroad will extend all the way to the west. You know, but rail was rapidly replacing canals, which canals took forever to build, and canals were very, very expensive. So rail becomes cheap. It becomes reliable. It's the most reliable form of transportation. And the men who built the railroads became very, very powerful. Here's your B&O Railroad. Extends all the way across. This is the whole B&O system. The Baltimore and the Ohio. Huge. Huge. 1840, there were 3,328 total miles of railroad in the United States. By the Civil War, that number had increased to over 30,000 total miles. By the end of the Civil War, the United States will have more miles of rail than all of Europe combined. 1859, rail tonnage, 2.2 billion, exceeded that of canals, 1.6 billion for the first time in history. So by 1859, railroads were becoming the most preferred form of transportation for products and for people. The majority of lines were in the north. There were only 3 links between the north and the south, as most lines went east-west. And the south, you're going to find that southerners were very bitter that most of the railroads were in the north. And you ask yourself, why did the south lack railroads? And again, it goes back to that old, what I said before, the South put all their money into slaves and land, and they didn't have the capital. They didn't have the capital to build the railroads. The railroad building, as we built railroads, it led to the growth of the coal industry, steel industries. It provided thousands of jobs. Rail gained supremacy over water travel simply because of their economy, their speed, and reliability. And companies would save 15% their transportation costs by using rail over other forms of transportation. But the rail also provided other direct benefits, which of course was Western settlement. It facilitated, really millions of immigrants to enter the United States and to integrate the entire economy, regional economy. Here you can see a chart showing the growth of rail in the 20 years prior to the Civil War. There you can see the railroad network. This, of course, is post-Civil War as well. Areas receiving New York newspapers within. Okay, so it shows you how fast news would spread. You know, how fast news would spread, how long it would take for news to spread. So the railroads actually connect and bind the country. News travels faster. Now places aren't so far away. Remember, the market revolution is about people becoming better connected. They're now connected by roads, canals, railroads, telegraph lines. It's a story about being better connected. What's the role of government in all this? These massive internal improvements were a product of both governmental and private initiatives, sometimes undertaken jointly and sometimes separately. Turnpikes would be those roads, were financed in the Northeast privately by private companies. In the South, roads were built by the state government. Canals were largely a state investment, and the Panic of 1837 caused the states to pull back and to leave railroad development mainly to private corporations. Most of the railroad capital came from private sources, but the government did play a major role. Southern and western states built railroad lines themselves, then eventually sold them to private companies. States offered companies land and huge tax incentives. And so this right here is going to be a major pro-business role of government in the building of railroads, is the giving railroad companies land and tax, and giving them tax breaks for building railroads. Manufacturing firms usually took the form of individual proprietorships, family enterprises, or partnerships. What we see in the antebellum period is the beginning of corporate America. Corporations, the forming of these very large companies that we often saw in banking and, transportation companies, canal companies, railroad companies. Corporations were regarded by the American people with suspicion as beneficiaries of organizations that got special privilege and posed threats against individual enterprises. In fact, the New York Stock Exchange will be established in the antebellum period that would, in which investors could buy shares of these companies, shares of these corporations, and as a way to generate capital for these new companies. This is a way, by forming corporations, this is how you build the new factories. This is how you're able to take your business and you expand it by selling shares of your company to investors, and then using the proceeds of those stock sales to then expand one's business with them. Foreign investments were important in building canals and railroads, but contributed very little to manufacturing. There are also two major advances in business organization that allowed for companies to thrive. Limited liability laws were passed that permitted individual investors claims or bankruptcy to protect their own assets separate from the company. So now, for example, if the company fails, if you start a company, if you start a factory, if you start a business, and that business fails, you can separate your personal income from the income of the business. So even though the business goes under, people don't. People protect their assets. Limited liability. And now what limited liability does is it gives incentives for investors and for businessmen to form companies and to invest in companies knowing that those investments are protected. Okay. The second advance in business organization would be the general incorporation laws that were first passed in New York in 1848. General incorporation laws essentially meant that if you're a businessman and you wanted to start a business, you no longer needed to get permission from the state legislature. You no longer needed permission from the government to start a company. Anyone can start their own corporation. And so big businesses and corporations are no longer for the elites. Okay, these laws, by the way, these very Jacksonian in nature. The belief is that anybody should be able to go into business. Anybody should be able to form a corporation. And so that's what these laws really enabled. By 1860, the United States, at the end of the day, was still predominantly agricultural and rural. Along the Hudson and Delaware rivers, however, industry rivaled that of any industrialized part of Britain and exceeded that of most parts of Europe. Cotton was the #1 major export, accounting for 2/3 of all exports leaving the United States. And of course, cotton fed the industrial machine in the North. And by 1860, there were 1.3 million workers and over 140,000 establishments. Capital investment tallied over $1 billion. There's $1 billion were invested in the United States economy through investors. And the output by 1860, $1.866 billion. In the North, what prevailed? Free labor ideology. Free labor ideology is the idea that the workers had freedom to choose where to work. In the South, we didn't have free labor ideology. In the South, we had slave labor. All right, so the two different concepts of labor are going to emerge. Free labor in the North, slave labor in the South. As America became more industrialized, it also became more urbanized. The rapid growth of factories impelled the growth of cities. And of course, 81% of all industries were in the Northeast. And therefore, most of the urban areas will be concentrated in the Northeast. In 1790, 3.3% of people lived in urban areas. By the Civil War, that number increases to 16.1%. And of course, a lot of that is owed directly to the immigration coming in from Europe at the time. Modern cities had 3 functions, 5 largest cities. Okay. Pittsburgh became a big center of iron production. Louisville, Kentucky, major trade center on the Ohio River. Cincinnati, Ohio is known as a real prominent meat packing industry there. You know, 'cause that's where all the cattle and the hogs, you know, would go to get slaughtered and turned into meat and food. Buffalo, Detroit, Cleveland, Milwaukee, major trade centers in the Great Lakes region. Chicago becomes a big rail hub where a lot of railroad lines end. And so by 1860, St. Louis and Chicago slip into the top 5. Here's the top 5 largest cities in 1820. Here we go by 1860. So got a lot of change going on there. And urbanization was both a consequence of economic growth and a positive force in its promotion. Industrial Revolution transformed working conditions. Okay, so skilled workers and craftspeople were often displaced by factory work. Wages were often depressed. Workers worked long hours, oftentimes 72 hours a week, where they had few breaks, worked in factories that were very poorly ventilated, poorly lit, and very cold during the wintertime. Workers were forbidden by law to unionize, and the conditions for women and children were especially oppressive. By 1820, half of the nation's industrial workers were younger than 10 years old. That is incredible. And women and children were often subject to physical abuse and oftentimes work-related deaths at a huge clip, huge number. And of course, 70% of all industrial workers lived in the Northeast. But with all this, we do see gains for workers. The Age of Jackson ushered in reforms for working men. The rise of working men's parties like Locos Focos in New York. Locos Focos is the name of one of the first working men's organizations, what we call unions. Okay, they fought for shortening the workday, higher wages, tolerable working conditions, public education for their children, Horace Mann, and the end to debtor prisons. The establishment of a 10-hour workday for federal employees. Strikes increased throughout the 30s and 40s, and most failed due to use of strikebreakers, where immigrants were brought in to replace the striking workers. Commonwealth versus Hunt, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that labor unions were constitutional as long as they were not violent or subversive. So that the Commonwealth versus Hunt is a very important Supreme Court case because it allowed for the formation of labor unions. Now, another big topic in the market revolution unit is the old immigrants. This is the first major wave of immigrants to flood into northern ports during the antebellum period. They're known as the old immigrants. They come largely from Northern and Western Europe, mainly from Ireland and Germany. And apart from the Irish, they were Protestants who learned English. They assimilated well into the American culture, and helped to create a melting pot in the North. They helped fill cheap labor jobs in the factories, especially the Irish. The Irish, let me see, the Irish, 2 million entered the United States from 1830 to 1860. Most were fleeing the potato famine. By 1860, more Irish live in the United States than in Ireland, and mostly concentrated in Boston and New York. They arrive in the United States facing extreme poverty. I mean, one thing we know about the Irish is they came with absolutely nothing. They were hated for that too. We'll talk about nativism here in a second. But they eagerly took industrial jobs. They worked for what were called starvation wages. They were prone to violence, alcoholism, and poverty. And the Irish slums were considered to be some of the most dangerous places in the United States. With a lack of money, they were unable to move west. So this is not an immigrant group that is going to move out west to take advantage of all the available land. These guys step right off the boat and right into a factory. They were courted by the Democratic Party in the North and become a very large voting bloc for the Democrats. They were often exploited by corrupt local Democratic Party political machines, which we'll learn about later on in another unit, Tammany Hall. Nativism, Irish nativism. Nativism is defined as anti-immigrant feelings. What drives nativism, what drives anti-immigrant feelings is one word: fear. They were afraid. Americans feared the flood of new immigrants into the United States. Now, obviously, the capitalists loved them. The political machines, the corrupt political machines, loved these Irish, but other than that, they were definitely not very popular. They were not welcomed. The Irish were Catholic in a largely Protestant nation. They came in the middle of the Second Great Awakening, which is probably the worst time they ever could have come. They're coming during a period in which we're having this Protestant revival in the United States. And so by 1860, Catholics outnumber Baptists, Methodists, and every other Protestant church. And that is a huge fear. The big fear is being outnumbered by the Catholics. We actually see the formation of a third political party called the Know Nothing Party, which sought to limit the influence of Catholics. They wanted the Know Nothing Party wanted laws to deport the poor Irish out of the United States. There were incidents of mass violence when it came to the Irish. They were often hated because they were used to break strikes. They drove down wages. They worked for wages that ordinary Americans, and they were known to have very high fertility rates. And so over time, the Irish become largely accepted. Okay, they largely become accepted, in large part due to the fact that they work really hard, they assimilate well, they gain wealth and a little standing, and over time the Irish are going to be generally accepted. So, as most immigrants are. During the same period, 1.5 million Germans entered the United States. Today, there are more Germans of American heritage than any other. Most came to the United States due to being displaced off their land in Germany. Crop failures contributed to their immigration to the U.S. And when they came to the United States, unlike the Irish, they had a little money in their pocket. So they stepped right off the boat and right onto a train, and they went out west, where they became what they were back in Germany. They became farmers. They moved to the Midwest. They set up successful farming communities, like Bernie. Okay. Okay. They formed a successful voting bloc like the Irish did. For example, they were the ones that helped swing the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. They were less influential in politics as their population was scattered throughout the West. They built public schools. They introduced kindergartens. They were staunch abolitionists. That's a typo, as they were Lutherans. They were staunch abolitionists. Whereas the Irish did not like the blacks. The Irish saw the blacks as competition for jobs. So the Irish were known to be fairly racist. whereas the Germans were very abolitionist. But a lot of the anti-German nativism was rooted in their beer drinking culture. And like the Irish, the Germans couldn't have come at the worst possible time. They came right smack dab in the middle of a very active temperance reform movement. But other than that, the nativism against the Germans was not as severe as what the Irish experienced. Here's in 2000, according to the census in 2000, a map of the United States by ancestry. And as you can see, there are more counties in the United States where German Americans constitute the majority. So they are one of the largest ancestry groups in the United States. Another immigrant group, which really isn't a big deal, they do account for 20% of all immigrants that arrive. And those are those from England, Mother England, the old mother country. They were mostly farmers. They came with skills. They found work. They worked in the textile mills. Many who came from the English mining regions also settled in the mining regions in the United States, places like Pennsylvania and Illinois, Michigan and Wisconsin. And as you can imagine, because of their Protestant faith, because of their English background, they faced the least nativism. There's the number of people by origin, country of origin, to come in. These are your old immigrants. This is the pre-Civil War, antebellum immigrants. And you can see there were other groups. You got your Scottish, your French. Scandinavia, it's fairly significant. You got 30,000 there. Okay, something going on with that slide. I'm going to pass it up. Okay, but one of the last topics we're going to address today is the topic of agricultural expansion. Of course, cotton has been used for a long time. It's been used since ancient times, but the Industrial Revolution and the spread of textile mills created a rapidly growing market for the fluffy staple. Cotton remained for many years rare and expensive because of the need of hand labor. Hand labor was very expensive. That's why very few planters in the United States grew cotton. Now, there were two varieties of cotton. You had your Sea Island cotton, okay, which originated around the mid-1780s, largely in Georgia and South Carolina. And then you had your green seed cotton, which is something you grow inland. And green seed is very difficult to harvest because it's very difficult to separate the seed from the plant. The only areas where cotton thrived originally was right here in the Sea Island areas, along the swampy areas in Georgia and South Carolina. And the green seed variety, which thrived inland, very few people would grow it. And people just basically gave up on it because it was so hard to harvest. But ultimately, what the Southern economy becomes, and we'll knock this out in our Masters and Slaves unit, but King Cotton, the term King Cotton was born on a plantation in Georgia called Mulberry Hill, which is the home of Miss Nathaniel Greene. And it was here in 1793 that Eli Whitney invented a cotton gin, a machine that separated the seeds from cotton 50 times faster than by hand. And of course, what did this do? What did the cotton gin do? It allowed cotton to be grown further inland. Now you can grow that green seed variety, and the machine does the work. Planters migrated westward with their slaves. They expanded their plantations. They expanded the size of their farms. They bought more and more slaves to work larger and larger farms. It tied the Southwest and the Southeast into a common interest. It unified the Southern economy around a quote-unquote cotton culture. And cotton will become the major export. 2/3 of all American exports, where, of course, will be sent to both England and to those northern textile mills. Cotton was the most important cause of expansion westward. The South supplied North with raw materials and markets for manufacturers. The income from the North's role in handling cotton trade then provided for the South more money with which to buy more land, more cotton. And so the expansion of the Northwest. Of course, the Northwest will provide the food in order for the Northeastern economy to grow. Northeastern economy grows because of the cotton. All right, so you see it's all integrated. The economy is all integrated with each other. And one of the basic tenets we'll learn in the Masters and Slaves unit is that the South resisted change to its economy and culture. Whereas in the North, Northerners are embracing a lot of change to it. And here's the King Cotton. Here you can see just by the percentage of slaves, where the slaves lived. In 1790, this is the day of George Washington. You can see where most of the slaves are concentrated. They're concentrated on those tobacco farms along the coasts, right? You're in the Chesapeake. By 1860, the Mississippi River Delta. South Carolina, of course, is the home of the King Cotton. But you can see the expansion of slavery over a 70-year period. Here's the growth of the cotton farms. Each dot represents 2,000 bales of cotton produced in 1840 at the very bottom. You can see around the rivers, the Tennessee River, the Missouri, look at the Mississippi River, the Arkansas River, right? And on the converse side, look at where the factories are concentrated. Look at where the factories are concentrated. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, the Hudson River, Delaware River. Delaware River, of course, is along the, it's in Pennsylvania. This is the home of the American Industrial Revolution before the Civil War. And where the North has a high propensity of factories, South does not. And again, it kind of shows you the type of agriculture you find in the three regions, the factories. And I wanted to put this here because this shows you the election of 1860, the election of Abraham Lincoln. And you'll see that the areas that vote for Lincoln, okay, you got to ask yourself, what did they do for a living? You know, what did they do for a living? You know, the Civil War was caused by the election of Abraham Lincoln. What I hope you ought to be able to do is look at this map and you look at those candidates down there and you'll be able to understand people vote with their pocketbooks, their economic interests. This is where we're going to end today's lecture. I will be in the morning. If you have any questions, I will be there to help you, absolutely help you. Anyway, that's all I have. I wish everybody a great, there we are. Wish everybody a happy day. Bye-bye.